All right, guys, let's move on to the next thing here. We're actually not going to be going through all these different computers, but I did want to, to kind of show you a lot of the stuff that was out there, where we came from, right? This right here is a loom. It's called the Jacquard loom. And there was a woman, and she programmed this. Yeah, women have this huge impact on computers over the years. Lots of women don't go into computers. I mentioned that in my video about jobs and such, and nobody knows why, because they used to. They really used to have a huge impact in computers. There's Pascal, a programming language, is named after her. There's operating systems named after her. Anyway, this is a loom, and they figured out that on this cloth paper here, they could program this to do the same thing over and over again, so that you're making the same rug over and over again. And that was really one of the first types of computers. And so they kind of take the term computer and go way, way back into things. I'm not going to go back that far. I'm going to start around here, ENIAC in 1944, because these machines in 1940s were fully electronic, as I mentioned in the other one. I always show this. I think this is kind of neat. Let's see if we can zoom in on that. I can't. Let me use this. There we go. Zoom in on this. This is a moth, and you'll notice that right here written on this piece of paper, it says Relay 7, Panel F, Moth in Relay. So it's kind of interesting to me that we use the term computer bug, that it actually comes from a bug. Back then, they used those big vacuum tubes that we talked about, and those big vacuum tubes generate a bunch of heat. And so when they had a problem in the programming, they would go through and suck all the bugs out to make sure that something wasn't connecting where it shouldn't be connecting, right? So that's what was happening. A moth flew in there, got electrocuted, but it was still letting that electricity flow, and it shouldn't have been. And so computer bugs come from an actual bug, which I think is kind of interesting. All right, so we're going to take a look at the mid-70s here, when basically what ends up happening is this weird thing in our society. There is a bunch of these transistors, integrated circuits, and microprocessors, and they're all kind of sitting around. It's almost like saying that somebody built the parts for an engine, but nobody ever put it together. That's just a weird scenario to happen. Usually something is created, right? This is what I created to make this. Instead, what we have is computers are these big things. They do taxes. They do census taking. Couldn't think of that word. They do all that kind of stuff, making money go around the world. Those were the original uses of computers and scientific endeavors like sending people to the moon. But they had taken those components, those big components, and started to shrink them down into transistors, integrated circuits, and microprocessors, and they were all just sitting there, and nobody was using them. Kind of strange. Well, as it always happens, those who have an interest or a problem to solve are the ones that innovate the new tools. Individuals that had used these mini computers, which were the size of refrigerators, or mainframe computers, which were size of rooms, they filled whole rooms, they had used them in high school or college. They wanted their own, because those big ones they had to share. Go down and you can sit there and you can program from 2 to 4 and then get off. It's somebody else's turn, right? So they wanted their own. They wanted their own personal computer. Those are the ones who invented, and there was a lot of inventors. So of course, this that we see on the screen is what we have now, all these really cool small things. Where did that really start from? Well, one of the places that it really started was this Altair 8800. Look at this thing. I don't know about you, but I'm not using it. I am not using that. I was a really little kid when this came out, but even if I had been my age, I would not have bought one of those. This is basically just a small mainframe. These lights are the way that you tell what's happening on the computer. There's no monitor. There's no keyboard. There's switches that you flipped up and down. I mean, it's just like, wow. So why do we really talk about this one? Because there was actually other computers before this one. We talk about it because of these two people. Bill Gates, most people know him from the Gates Foundation and Microsoft, and Paul Allen, and they created Microsoft. So here's the interesting story about them. And I use these two as an example because they saw the wave happening. They understood how important this was. And of course, they ended up being massively successful. You know, both of them have made millions. Bill Gates has made billions. And what was their involvement here? Well, both of them knew each other in high school. And the honest truth is they were rich kids. But Bill Gates, if you watch some of the stuff on him, it's really incredible how smart he was. But he got to work on computers when he was in high school at the rich private schools. He was at school in Yale, so it's not like his family didn't have money. They just didn't have Bill Gates money. And he got to use the computers then. And so they kind of knew, hey, computers are really going to move forward and they're really going to be more accessible for people, and more people will be able to use them. They knew that was going to happen. And so what happened was Paul Allen saw the ad for one of these and said, hey, it's happening. Bill Gates was actually at Yale at the time. So he created a compiler for this, which is BASIC. BASIC is a programming language which was easier to use than the old programming languages that were available at the time. So if you try to use it now, there's much easier programming languages to use now. But back then there was not. And a compiler basically takes the basic code, that's why we call it coding. We take that programming that somebody types in kind of a broken English situation and converts it down to something that this will understand. So it compiles it together so that this computer can use it. So instead of having to go to this computer and go flip switch, flip switch, flip switch, now the answer is 14, you could actually program for this thing. Later on, monitors were made and that kind of thing. You could hook these things up. But in any case, they saw, hey, this is happening, so let's go ahead and take this basic programming language and get it to work on this machine. Now, Bill Gates was so smart that he actually created this compiler for this machine without having one of those machines. Can you imagine that? So he's got the schematics of how the thing runs and works, and he actually writes down, this is what needs to happen in order for that to work. Amazing. Now, this was being produced over in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, as a matter of fact. And so they drove over there to Albuquerque, and he typed all that in, and it worked. And that's where Microsoft Corporation began. They got a contract to basically sell this compiler for this particular computer. And they did the same thing over and over again. They did it for Commodores, they did it for Ataris, they did it for Apples, they did it for any computer. And that BASIC, MS BASIC, Microsoft BASIC was so popular that they, that's where they really started. As a matter of fact, he actually had a incident while he was over there. He drove a piece of road equipment that somebody left the keys in while he was drunk and got arrested. So if you ever see that, you can search for it online and you'll see him smiling. He looks like he's 14, but he's actually not. That's when that happened because they were so excited. There was lots of other inventors. Chuck Peddle, one of them, he built a single machine, and then later on it led to the Commodore PET, which what they figured was, let's not call it a computer, let's call it a personal electronic transactor, because it does more than just calculate numbers. They bought out this company known as MOS, which built this chip, 6502. And the only reason I mention that is because it was in all these stand-up arcade games. It was in the Nintendo, the first Nintendo that was out there. It was actually in the Apple II. And so there was all this development that was happening and all this excitement in the industry. Now, as we move along, let's take a look at these two guys, the Apple I and the Apple II. Apple becomes a big deal in this, and we usually don't talk about Commodore, even though they sold, we'll get to that, they sold more systems than Apple ever did at that time. But we talk about these guys because they're still around. Commodore is not around. So here's Steve Jobs, and a lot of people know who he is, kind of. And this is Steve Wozniak. He's still alive. He's kind of known as the engineering wizard of this. And these were a couple of other individuals that got it. Both of them were very engineer mindset, and they lived on the same block. And he built a computer that could actually use a monitor. And remember, this one did not. So he built a computer that could actually have a monitor and a keyboard. And I know that sounds like, duh. I mean, why wouldn't it be that way? But nobody had done that yet. They had printouts is what they used. But anyway, so what happens is Steve Jobs, he was really kind of the business visionary. And no, it's not like the movies are stupid. None of them are really correct. He saw that there was a market for the computer. So there's no internet. It's not like you can go on the internet and see all these people that are all working on kind of the same thing you're doing. That's not there. And so in their little bubble, there was this club known as the Homebrew Computer Club. And they basically would try to one up each other. Like, look at what my computer can do as compared to yours. Well, Wozniak had built an awesome computer. He was really an engineering genius, some of the stuff he did. And so what Steve Jobs did with Wozniak is say, hey, let's sell this. And back then they're just talking about a computer board. That was the Apple One. Like, hey, let's sell this. And Wozniak's like, no, I can't do that because I work for HP. All of you know who HP is. Well, they were a computing firm back then too, but it wasn't computing like now. And he said, basically HP owns this. I don't want them to know about it. Now, why would HP own it? Well, if you're an engineer, usually the first job or maybe the job you end up in has an agreement that anything that you build on your own becomes theirs. And so that was his standard agreement. And so Steve Jobs basically said, hey, let's go down there and talk to them. And I bet you they'll just give us the rights because they won't even know what they're really looking at. And he was so influential, that's what people say. And Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak says this too, that he convinced him to go down there. Now, this was all after they took it to the computer club, and Wozniak really outshined everybody. And Jobs saw that. He's like, wow, all these people would buy this if we could sell it. So they go down and talk to this guy. And this is another example of somebody who doesn't get it and compared to the people that do get it. And so they take it in there, and they've got it in a little wooden box. You can look up Apple One and you'll see that. And they basically say to the guy, hey, we want rights to sell this. And the guy just signs it off and says, there you go sell your stupid machine. Nobody's going to use a personal computer because computers are used for taxes and they're used for all sorts of big stuff like sending people to the moon. Definitely nobody wants their own personal. What is a person going to do with a computer? So they sign off on it and, of course, become millionaires within a few years. They actually were going to sell their idea to these guys. But this one, Jack Tramiel, who was notorious, he's the one that termed the business as war. So you see stuff about that. That was this guy. And Jobs didn't get along. Imagine that. Those two personalities wouldn't. So tons of stuff happened at the time. Commodore PET came out right after that. Radio Shack made their little, what they called a Trash 80. The Osborne came out, which was a mobile system that you could carry around. It was just incredible, all the innovation that was happening at the time. And one thing that you should know, so, just highlight this for you. Later on, as these systems got more capable and got color and that kind of stuff and sound, all that cool stuff that we use today, the Commodore 64 that came from the PET that these people made was the first and only single model of a computer to sell 1 million units. So it has the great title of being the most popular computer of all time because there was a single model of that and it sold 1 million units. So there was, revisions to it, but the Commodore 64 sold 1 million units. Now I'm leading up to something here. The question is why? Why? So look at the cost of this, heavily used in education. Atari was the same. I throw the Atari in there because people are like, I know the name Atari, right? Asteroids. They know that stuff. So the Atari was in there around the same price. But as compared to others, right, here's the IBM PC. It comes in around the same time, and it costs $1,500. $700, $1,500. Now that's about half. So to break it down for you, this was computing costs in the 80s. So if you actually took inflation, right, this would be about $4,000 or $5,000 that people were buying these machines for. Commodore and Atari, that would still be about $3,000 or so that people were buying these computers for. But let's not get into that, right? You're not going to buy a computer for that price. But back then we did. It was basically the good used car price was the price of a computer. But why would these right here on the top become the choice of the world, especially the United States, when you had these that were so much cheaper? Now, I haven't given you any information, but I want you to think about that. Why would you buy something more expensive? Well, always remember that computing or anything is about people, and people affect computing trends. This is about people and what they were doing at the time and what they had to do at the time. Because when you look in the past and say, wow, an IBM cost, this is the low end to the high end, why would somebody buy one of these? Why would they even buy an Apple? Why wouldn't you buy one of these? And if they had bought a bunch of these, where are they today? Why are these gone, but these are still here? IBM and Apple, they're still here, but Commodore, Atari are not. Right? So why does it happen? People affect computing trends. This is what happened. Ultimately, people with no computer training were asked to use something at work that was very different from a typewriter, pencil, and paper. And many were told they would be fired if they didn't learn how to use the PC. That's what was happening at the time. Now, I was young. I didn't know anything about all that stuff happening. I just thought computers were cool. But I had my first computer teacher, and I asked him, I said, how did you get into teaching computers? And he said, well, I worked for a firm actually in California, in Silicon Valley, and computers came into our industry. And he said, I was excited. So couldn't afford to get one on my own, but the business was going to buy one. And so he said, we walked in one day, and there's about 12 people that worked at this firm. It wasn't huge. And there was these computers on the desks, all set up, bunch of books, that you would learn from. And he's excited, but most of the people there are not excited. They're talking about, I don't need to use them. The way I do it is just fine. Why would they want these? That thing's getting off my desk immediately, all this stuff. And he said, wisely, the owners of this business had held off coming in. They were just a little late, which they normally never were, he says. And they walked in, and everybody, or most everybody, exploded and started, hey, I'm not going to use this, and I don't know why I would have to use this, and the way I work is just fine. And as, it got louder and louder, they silenced everybody, told them to be quiet, and they said, this is the way the work's going to get done. Everything you do is going to be done on those computers, and if you don't like it, there's the door. Use it now. And he said about 4 or 5 people actually left that day. He was excited to actually sit down and learn, but a lot of other people weren't. Now, he says the silly, stupid thing is that only a couple of those could actually retire, right? They were at that age that they could actually just say, I'm done. I got my savings, and I'm going to, go fishing. The others just ended up going down the road, where a few months later or a year later, the same thing happened to them. This was a revolution that was sweeping across everything. This wave was flooding everybody. And I can't even imagine, I can kind of imagine, right? Because when I was really little, I actually wrote a paper on a typewriter. That was when I was younger. And yeah, everybody used pencil and paper all the time. So I can kind of imagine that, but I was young enough that using a computer was this thing that I liked to do, and it was not that big of a deal to me to do it. But just imagine that you're 40, 50 years old, and all of a sudden here's this thing, and now something that used to mean one thing means another. What do I mean by that? Well, file that. Okay, well, if you're talking about paper, that means take this folder or piece of paper and go and put it in the filing cabinet. But now all of a sudden, the computer has a file system, and you file it in the computer in a directory or a folder. And just think of navigating that. Go to C:// these people were lost. They were absolutely lost. Now, businesses chose the IBM computer because IBM was the name, right? If I choose IBM, the thing will not crash on me. It'll be successful. That's the way we looked at it. And so IBM was used by businesses everywhere because they trusted IBM. But people in home bought them as well. And why is because there was no networking back then. There was, but we didn't get to use it. So they would have to take a floppy disk home. Compatibility was a huge issue. But if I have the same computer at work that I have at home, I can take the floppy back and forth and do my work, right? Most people had to learn on their own. You can't sit there during your day and decide, well, I'm learning how to use a computer. It's like, well, what about all the work you have to do? Get that done. Yeah, but I have to use a computer to do it. Well, do that on your own time, right? And so they would go out, he said, they would go out right down to the store and they would say, I need this model of computer. They'd write it straight off of what they had at work and these software packages. And $4,000 later, they would go home with the computer and software packages so that they could go home from work, figure out what to do, and then go back to work. Now, that's a huge, huge challenge, and that may happen in your life. It will happen in little micro ways, like I mentioned, the iPad coming in hospitals, and now I got to learn how to use this program on the iPad as opposed to the one I had on Windows, that kind of thing. That little stuff will happen for sure. And so they didn't want to relearn concepts, and they had to have the same software, and they had to have the same hardware so they could use floppy drives. So I might as well just buy the exact same thing that I have at work. Others didn't do that, right? He didn't do that. He was able to say, well, I'll have this one at home and this one at work because he could learn that stuff very quickly. So remember that why people choose a certain product. So remember why people choose a certain product, especially when it costs more, is not a simple concept to figure out why, because there's many variables involved in that. I just told you okay, so why people choose a certain project, especially when it costs more than another, is not a real simple concept to try to figure out because there are a lot of variables behind the scene. These variables I just gave you, that's why they did that. Technology trends are influenced by culture, but more importantly, by needs, what somebody needs. For instance, this is a little small example I'll give you. When digital music players were brand new, most people chose an iPod. Why? Because it worked. Now, I was around and I was working at that point, and I was not an Apple fan. And so I really didn't want to get an iPod. I used other stuff. HP was actually the first vendor for digital media players. So I used other ones, but they really had massive flaws. It's like, oh, you can do this stuff. Yeah, you can. If you take 15 hours, it would lose playlists. Half your files would get deleted for no reason. It was just really ridiculous. But you had an iPod, you just plugged it in and you went drag and drop, made the playlist, and it was done. Right? So originally, they bought iPods because they worked. Then later, as that becomes the thing to do, other people look and they say, I'll do that. For instance, I will notice in my class that a person will bring a computer in and they'll use Chrome. So that means they had to go out and download and put Chrome on their computer to use Chrome. And why do they use Chrome? Why? Well, because everybody else does. That's why. Somebody said Chrome's the best, so use Chrome. And it's hit that point where that's what people do. It's not the fastest. It's not the most secure. It was the fastest, for a couple of years, way back when it first came out. But it's no longer the fastest. Usually Opera is the fastest. But anyway, then later, because that's what others are using, that becomes a big factor.
Here's a couple of storage devices. This is an older SD card, and this is a USB flash drive that kind of broke. And right there, that is the controller or processor. And on the other side is the actual storage. And this is just amazing to me. What you have in a USB flash drive is more powerful than the original computer that they sent people to the moon with. That is truly amazing. And to think that that happened just in about 40, 50 years. And so, wow, where are we going beyond that? Where are we going to grow into? What are these computers going to be doing for us, or can they do for us? We don't know. We don't know, but that's part of this class, is thinking about that. How will these things affect where you work? When you go out and do your job, how is it going to affect things? To give you an idea, quantum computing, that's so powerful. Actually, we have computers powerful enough to do this now, but quantum computing would make it so that you could bring a patient in, they could sit down and answer a bunch of questions to an AI, and then the AI would then say, well, it's one of these 5 things, right? And then send that information to the doctor, and when you saw the doctor, he wouldn't have to do the diagnostics. He might ask you a couple more questions, but the AI already did that. That really affects medicine. It affects it to the point of, a family medical facility might have 10 doctors in it. Well, now you only need 3, right? Technology continues to disrupt things and change things. It has for years. In the 80s, what happened then was lots of people lost their jobs automaking, right? They didn't put the cars together anymore. The robots did it. The computers did it because they could program them to do it. And so those are things that you have to think about. Not everything that a computer does has a good effect on society. And so how will it affect you in your life, in your job?